In our previous chapter, we learned about the general principles and basic concepts of microeconomics. So microeconomics is one of the primary branch of economics, along with macroeconomics. So we are done with the basic foundation of microeconomics. Let us now move on with the other one, which is macroeconomics. So our lesson 2 will tackle about the goals, measures, and challenges of macroeconomics. So here are the learning outcomes for this lesson. At the end of this chapter, you will be able to define the nominal gross domestic product and the real gross domestic product. You will be able to compare and contrast various measures of output and income. You will be able to differentiate real and nominal values. And also, you will be able to analyze the problems associated with using GDP as a measure of well-being. So in macroeconomics, we are going to study the total output that an economy generates. So macroeconomics will tackle on a larger scope or wider scope in compared to microeconomics. So pag-uusapan natin dito yung buong ekonomiya ng isang bansa. No? But we are not going to focus only on a specific country, but we are going to compare also, no, the economy of one country to another. Okay? So economists use GDP to measure the country's total output. So in macroeconomics, GDP or the gross domestic product is one of the accurate indicator to measure the country's total output. So ano ba yung mini-measure ni GDP? So it measures the monetary value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders in 1 year. So lahat ng napoproduce na goods and services, no? Final goods and services ng isang bansa na within their territory sa loob ng isang taon, no? Yun yung kino-compute sa GDP. The value, no? The monetary value of all those final goods and services. So macroeconomics tend to use real GDP rather than nominal GDP, since real GDP removes the effect of inflation or takes into account the effect of inflation. So we are very familiar with inflation. So pag sinabi nating inflation, this refers to the changes in prices over time. Okay? So we are very familiar with this. Just like for example, the price of a vegetable 1 or 2 or 3 years later will be different from the price of this current year. Okay? So real GDP and nominal GDP, if you have watched the video that I've posted, you will easily identify the difference between real and nominal GDP. But one of the distinction of real GDP and nominal GDP is that real GDP takes into account the effect of inflation. So, kumbaga, mas reliable na indicator si real GDP because kino-consider niya yung effect ng inflation in computing the GDP. Sa nominal GDP kasi, kung ano yung nominal or initial value or the current price of those goods and services, yun yung i-consider sa pag-compute ng GDP. While si real GDP, nire-remove niya yung effect ng inflation or kino-consider niya yung inflation, no, or yung changes in prices over time to reflect truly, no, the monetary value of our GDP. So governments focus on 3 key indicators of economic growth. So ito raw yung usual, no, na ginagamit na indicators ng isang bansa to measure their economic growth. Kung nakikita nila na nag-grow ba yung kanilang economy. So number 1 na nga dyan is yung pagkakaroon ng increase in real GDP over time. Okay? Then full employment and price level stability. So what is the importance or what is the significance of the gross domestic product or the GDP? So the primary measure of the ups and downs of economic activity is real GDP. Okay? So real GDP measures the actual economic activity of a country. So, through GDP, doon din ma-identify kung there are ups and downs in the production, in the efficiency of the economic activity. So, kapag ka daw tumataas ang economic output, it will create more jobs, which in turn will create more income for people and more opportunities for people. So, kumbaga, if there is a positive change in the real GDP or positive impact in the real GDP, magdo-domino effect siya, no, sa income, sa opportunities, sa spending and consumption ng tao. No, sa production, it will increase, and so on and so forth. So in the long run, an economy's output and income relative to its population will determine the material standard of living of its people. So si GDP somehow, na-measure din niya yung standard of living ng tao. Okay? So gaya na example nga natin, ano? Pagka okay or increasing, no? At positive yung ating real GDP, it will create more jobs. Okay? So kapag ka nakapag-create ng more jobs, it will create more income for the people. Pag more income, more spending and consumption for people. That means more demand. So pag more demand, so magkakaroon niya ng impact dun sa ating supply. No? So mas ganadong mag-produce, no? Mas ganadong mag-produce yung ating mga producers or suppliers. Okay? So iikot na ng iikot yung ating business cycle kapag ka maganda yung ating GDP. So, through GDP, makikita natin somehow, no, yung picture, no, kung nagkakaroon ba ng progress, kung nagkakaroon ba ng economic growth, no, in terms of the whole economy, as well as the standard of living of its people. So, GDP again is one of the most widely used measures of an economy's output or production. So, one tool lang si GDP kasi there are also other tools used to measure an economy's output or standard of living. So again, this refers to the total value of goods and services produced within a country's borders. So within the territory of a country, no, all of the goods, the value of the goods and services produced within that territory or border in a specific time period, yun yung i-consider nila. So usually, 1 year. So sa loob ng isang taon, how much is the monetary value or total value of the goods and services produced within the Philippines? So that will be the GDP. So it is an accurate indicator of the size of an economy, and the GDP growth rate is probably the single best indicator of economic growth, while GDP per capita has a close correlation with a trend in living standards over time. So GDP, it indicates the size of the economy through the measurement of the total output. While GDP per capita, no? So GDP per capita is related to GDP in the sense na si GDP per capita naman, ang minimeasure niya is the living standard of people over time. Okay? So, increasing nga yung GDP natin, no? But the GDP per capita reflects the standard of living of people. May changes ba or may progress din ba sa standard of living ng tao kahit na or merong increase sa ating GDP, no? So sometimes kahit increasing ang GDP, it does not necessarily mean din na okay ang standard of living ng tao or nag-i-increase din ang standard of living ng tao. Kasi nga, there are instances na yung GDP natin sometimes ay na-overestimate or na-underestimate din. Okay? So, why is GDP important? So, a country's GDP provides insight into its economy that informs business and investment decision making. So, GDP again is an accurate and reliable indicator of the status, no, of the economy, no, if it is growing, okay, or if it is progressing in terms of production or total output. So through the GDP, no, so it helps the economy to make business and investment decisions. Okay? So, as a whole, syempre, nagkakaroon din ng planning, no? Economic plan for a certain country. So, isa sa basihan, no? Isa sa reliable indicator or basihan, si GDP. So, GDP is considered by economists to be the most important measure of economic activity in nations for several reasons. So, what are those reasons? First, it tells us something about the relative size of different countries' economies. So, if you're going to compare our GDP to other countries, doon natin makikita yung size or yung output natin kung i-compare natin siya sa ibang bansa. Okay? So, in order for us to truly identify or truly determine if tayo ba ay nag-grow, yung economy natin ay nag-grow or nagpa-progress, syempre, we need to compare the GDP of our country to other country. No? So, if you have watched the video that I've posted, we compare, or in the video, it compared the GDP of the Philippines to other Southeast Asian countries. No? We have the Thailand and Singapore. No? So, can easily identify there if nagpo-progress na ba sa Philippines. No? At kaya ba niyang makipag-compete sa mga Southeast Asian nations and even to the other countries. So, second reason, it is a monetary measure. So, it tells us how much income a country earns in a year. So, meron kasing value No? We can measure. Merong monetary value. So, we can measure. So, it tells how much income a country earns in a year through the production. No? So, ang minemeasure kayo sa GDP is yung unang-una yung napoproduce. No? Yung final goods and services na pinoproduce ng ating bansa na binibili ng ating mga consumers or ng ating customers. Okay? So, merong monetary value assigned through the price. No? So, through the price, we can determine the monetary value of those final goods and services. No? So, kaya na-identify ng ating mga economists and statisticians yung figures or yung amount ng ating GDP. So, it indicates if a country's economy is growing or shrinking. So, another reason, So, reliable indicator nga si GDP kung nag-grow ba or nag-shrink yung ating economy. So, it is also used to compare a country with other countries. It is used to assess the well-being of the citizens of a country. The main assumption is that as GDP rises, so does the well-being of the citizens of a country. That is the main assumption, but that is not always the case. So, gaya nga ng sabi ko kanina, pwedeng ma-overestimate din sometimes ang GDP. No? So, later i-discuss natin yon. So, pwedeng ma-overestimate din kasi ang GDP. So, kahit na nag-i-increase or tumataas yung GDP, there are instances na hindi rin ibig sabihin nun ay tumataas din ang well-being or standard of living ng citizens or ng tao sa isang bansa. Okay? So, we will discuss that later. But, the main assumption is that as GDP rises, nagkakaroon din daw ng pagtaas dun sa well-being at standard of living ng mga tao dun sa bansa na yun. Okay, so paano ba mine-measure ang ating GDP? So measuring GDP involves counting up the production of millions of different goods and services like phones, cars, music downloads, computers, steel, bananas, college educations, and all other new goods and services produced within the current year. So we're just going to take the sum of the goods and services produced and consumed by the people. So here are the steps. Take the quantity of everything produced for step 1. So lahat, goods and services. Step 2, multiply it by the price at which each product sold. So the price. So si price ang magsisilbing ating factor to determine the monetary value. Okay, then step 3, just add up the total. So, ganun lang kasimple yung pag-compute ng GDP. So, just take the quantity of everything produced then multiply by the price, then add up the total. So, meron kasi tayong components ng GDP. So, we have 4 components of GDP. So, ito yung pagsasama-samahin natin. Ito yung isa-sum up natin. No? So, we're just going to classify what type of GDP or component of GDP. So, meron tayong 4. So, we have first, consumption. Ito yung pinaka-largest component ng GDP because it represents the household spending, Then, private investment. So, ito yung spending by the business firms for their business. Next, we have the government purchases at all levels. And we have the net exports. So, to get the net exports, ilaless natin yung imports kay exports. So, the formula na gagamitin natin ay GDP is equal to consumption or C plus private investment or I plus government purchases or G plus net exports or XN. Okay? Or GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus XN or the net exports. So, isa-isahin natin, So, again, personal consumption or the consumption is the largest component of our GDP because it represents the household spending. So, lahat ng binibili ng ating households, groceries, healthcare services, clothing, automobiles, etc., all of those needs and wants ng households, okay, ay minimeasure. Lahat ng value nun ay kailangang i-measure. Okay? All those purchased by the households. Next, for the private investment. So, these are spending by the firms. So, these are the value of all goods produced during a period for use in the production of other goods and services. So, ito yung mga spending ng businesses in order for them to be used for production. Or ito yung ginagamit nila for their production sa kanilang businesses or in provision of services to their customers. So, like personal consumption, gross private domestic investment is a flow variable. It is often simply referred to as private investment. So, private investment ang ating common na tawag sa spending ng businesses. Next, we have the government purchases. So, these are the sum of purchases of goods and services from firms by government agencies, plus the total value of output produced by government agencies themselves during a time period. So, usually, ang government purchases nila ay umaabot ng 20% ng GDP. Okay? So, government purchases, these are the purchases of goods and services na ginagamit nila. Okay? So, binibili nila from different businesses or firms, and then ginagamit nila. So, example, we have the office equipment, vehicles, buildings, janitorial services, and so on. Okay? So, meron din naman silang pinoproduce. So, meron din silang output na pinoproduce. Like, for example, police departments produce police protection, public schools produce education. So, take note, government purchases are not the same thing as government spending. So, government purchases, ang example natin kanina ay yung pagbili ng government from the firms. Na example natin yung mga equipments, land, building, etc. Ang government spending, it takes the form of transfer payments. These are payments that do not require the recipient to produce a good or service in order to receive them. So, sa government purchases, kanina, bumibili sa government from firms in exchange of money, syempre. Okay? In order for them to acquire the equipments, the fixtures, the furnitures, the building, the land, etc. Dito kay government spending, these are the contributions, or these are payments to people na kahit hindi mag-produce or mag-render ng service yung people na makaka-receive. Okay? Ay okay lang. Meron pa rin silang may receive. So, example, para mas maintindihan nyo, ay yung mga pension na pinoprovide no, ng ating social security system, no, to retired people. Yung SAP, no, yung SAP or yung social assistance na pinoprovide, no, ng ating government to poor people, na kahit wala namang pinoproduce yung poor people in exchange of payment or assistance na marireceive nila, no, yun po yung tinatawag nating transfer payment. Or even yung unemployment compensation to people who have lost their jobs. Okay? So, kahit walang nire-render na service or pinoproduce na goods yung people na nawala ng trabaho, they still receive compensation. So, those are examples of transfer payments. So, yun po ay papasok sa government spending. So, hindi siya nasasama sa GDP ng isang bansa because it does not reflect the production of a good or service. So, transfer payments are not included in a nation's GDP since there is no production of a good or service. Next, we have the net exports. So again, to get the net exports, you just need to subtract imports from exports. So we are very familiar with exports and imports. So sales of a country's goods and services to buyers in the rest of the world represent exports. So every country, lahat naman yan nag-export ng something na meron sila to other countries. And also, hindi rin syempre may iwasan ng imports. Okay? So, for example, a purchase by a Japanese buyer of a Ford Taurus produced in the United States is a US export. Okay? So, ang buyer is a Japanese. No? Ang binili is a Ford Taurus na pinroduce sa US. So, it will be considered as a US export since it is a product of US. Exports also include such transactions as the purchase of accounting services from a New York accounting firm by a shipping line based in Hong Kong or the purchase of a ticket to Disney World by a tourist from Argentina. So, it does not talk only about the products. So, including services, no? Yung mga nag-outsource ng services from other country, that will be considered also as export of that country. Okay? Or yung simply pagbili ng ticket for Disney, no, for Hong Kong Disneyland, no, that will be considered as the export of Hong Kong since ang mga bumibili ng tickets nila ay nanggagaling yung iba sa ibang bansa or from a tourist. So that will be considered as the export. When it comes to imports, these are purchases of foreign produced goods and services by country's residents during a period. So United States imports include such transactions as the purchase by Americans of cars produced in Japan. So vice versa naman, kung ang yung mga Americans naman ang bumili ng cars produced in Japan, no? So that will be considered imports ni US, no? And that will be the export of the Japan. Or tomatoes grown in Mexico or stay in a French hotel by tourists from the United States. So that will be the import for US. And exports naman siya for Mexico and France. So again, to get the GDP, we just need to add the consumption, the private investment, government purchases, and net exports.